Hi everybody, Vanquished Angel here, and welcome back to my channel. I filmed this a couple of times. I'm also not feeling very good, so I might swallow and cough a little bit. But today's topic is, what is Linux? Now that's kind of a complicated question. Linux, technically, is a core part of an operating system written by a man named Linus Torvalds. He took Unix back before software could be copyrighted and rewrote large chunks of it and came up with his own kernel, and this became known as Linux, a combination of his name Linus and Unix, where it's from. So that's the technical term of what Linux is actually the core. Now the more street term that people use is referring to any open source operating system using his kernel that he wrote. Sorry, this is a bit misleading, because there's a lot more people that contribute to the code than just him. Unlike Windows, Linux has hundreds of thousands of developers from all over the globe. Most of them are just doing this because it's a passion, or that's how they support themselves. So they don't work for a big software company, or sometimes they do, depending, that contributes to Linux. And then they kind of live off donations, or they just do it to make things better. So Linux is really this massive collaboration of hundreds of thousands of developers all around the world. So like a good example of that is Linus writes the core, but GNU project writes another 45% of the operating system. So they have like Totem and GStreamer for media libraries and other things that they write, and like GCC and stuff like that they contribute to all the operating systems out there. So because of this, and then you have your smaller developers that write other programs and other softwares, and some of them are larger. And they all kind of work together. So you have this, like Totem, for instance, relies on GStreamer now. I think these are both written by the GNU project, but let's say they weren't. The person writing Totem, which relies on the GStreamer libraries, has to kind of coordinate. And sometimes if the GStreamer updates, then it might break the compatibility with Totem. So really, this is just all this big collaboration, and that does sometimes still actually happen. But, that said, so Linux really, on the street version, is these open source operating systems, which are really a big collaboration. And then my definition. This big collaboration takes place all over the world at all times, and they're not even talking to each other most times. Or sometimes they are, but most times they're not. So one writes this one part, and another writes this part, and another writes this part, and another writes this part, and then another person puts this together and creates this part, and that's kind of how Linux works. It's basically a very layered operating system with all these softwares and all these developers coming together really without even talking to each other most times. Each of them improving their little part of the bigger picture. So to me, Linux is actually a community of people that work together to make things better. And I will give a few examples of how this happens and the things that they overcome, and why, and how everyone benefits from Linux, even people that have never heard of it and don't use it. So like back in the early days after Linus invented it, Linux took a while. It was kind of a geek toy, and people were adding their own parts and improving it just basically for funsies. Red Hat started at about 1995. Now Red Hat is kind of a pivotal Linux. Red Hat is actually a corporation of Red Hat Enterprises, and their operating system, Red Hat Linux, is on servers. That's their paid version. And they used to give out the operating system free to the home user. So what happens with that is that, first off, Red Hat tackled part of the problem with people adopting Linux, and that is for servers. A lot of technicians, you're raised on Microsoft. You know, Microsoft, Bill Gates gave out computers to the schools and stuff, and they get a discounted rate or something. And so your children, or you, are taught Microsoft right in school. So you're kind of going over that learning curve that people don't realize Microsoft actually has. So one of the deterrents to changing to Linux is this supposed learning curve, but I'll kind of get back to that maybe a little bit later. So you're taught Microsoft. and you're used to things as being a certain way being taught Microsoft. And because you have it in school, bosses will use it, because that's what you were taught in school. And while you're going to school, when you get a computer for home to do your homework or something, you're going to buy Microsoft. Because, well, you don't really have a choice. All computers kind of come with it now. Well, not so much these days, but used to. So you used it at home because you also used it at school, and then employers got it because you used it at home and you used it at school. And so it's this kind of self-fulfilling business. And so, anyway, a lot of people were adapted to Microsoft. And so Red Hat decided to take this on. And they came up with an ingenious way. And that is, they designed their operating system at this time like Microsoft. Except, Microsoft has a few copyrights, and one of those is a word. Now, legally, you can't copyright a word. However, on computer programming, apparently a word can be copyrighted, and that word is start. So a lot of technicians would just stare at a Linux and didn't know what to do. They had no idea of what they're doing. Red Hat solved this problem by putting a symbol where the start menu would be, and in this case, a red fedora, and a picture of a red fedora. So, and this was pivotal because now they knew where to start. And it sounds trivial to you and me, but in truth, Microsoft paid for psychology before they designed their graphical user interface operating system. And they paid for the study of a man who tried to teach chimps to talk, or monkeys to talk. And he made some progress, and some progress was one place to start from. And in this case, it's the start menu. So they could figure out a lot of other things from that point as long as they had one place to start from. And so that's kind of how that happened. And so as long as they had that symbol, people knew where to start. They could figure it out from there. And so Red Hat has a lot of servers on the server end of things. Another contributor was Debian. Microsoft had that .exe installer. Well, that makes things easy to install. On Microsoft, you have to scour the internet, go to questionable websites, download some programs you might need or whatever. Maybe you get a virus, maybe you don't. You double-click on the exe and it installs. And since Microsoft is the only developer of Microsoft products, basically they're all coordinated. However, in Linux, you have multiple choices. So they're not quite coordinated. You could use this program, or this program, or this program, or this one. And a dependency, a program depends on other programs. In Microsoft, you don't really have that because it's all there and it's all developed by Microsoft. So it comes from one source. So to solve all those issues, came the Debian installer. Now there's other installers on Linux, but in this case the Debian really surpassed Microsoft's installer. You just click it and it handles your dependencies, and if you don't have the dependencies or aren't able to get them, it doesn't install. That's just the way it is. But it downloads the dependencies for you and compatible libraries and things, and kind of handles just about all of that for you. So the Debian installer really simplified things. Another concept in Linux is repositories. Now there's been Git repositories. Linus Torvalds made the Git repository or contributed a lot to that. But Debian has its own repository. And what a repository is a place where software for an operating system is stored. So the people who write the Debian operating system have their own repositories for software that work with that operating system. And the overwhelming vast majority of that software is free. Windows is starting to rip this off with their store. Apple, same thing. Android, Google Play is actually just a repository. This was in Linux since the mid-90s, somewhere in there. So that's how Debian contributed. And then how Ubuntu contributed was the 1,000 paper cuts rule. So they took on that part of, if there's not a big problem, but a little tiny glitch that most advanced users can handle. So they really didn't pay attention to it because experienced Linux users, wasn't no problem to handle it. But however, a new user coming from Windows isn't used to dealing with those things, and especially not doing it on their own. This was called a paper cut because it deterred them. So it might be something as simple as editing a little text file that most advanced Linux users could do. But a Windows user, more than likely, is not going to be able to do that. So Ubuntu started taking on fixing those little paper cuts. So that's their contribution. Now, a lot of you are like, and so that's kind of explaining how the community works. Everybody helps everybody, essentially, and they all contribute. And the business model in Linux is a lot more diverse than it is in most other areas of business. And so Linuxes are primarily everywhere. Most people don't realize that they actually already use Linuxes on a fairly regular basis. You go online, chances are you're connecting to a Linux server. You have a smartphone in your pocket. If it's Android, guess what? That's a Linux. You're connecting through a modem and a router. Most of those run a variation of Linux. That's kind of how it is. So you actually do use Linux. So back in the day when I first started using Linux, the question was, when is Linux going to take over? Because it is a superior operating system, despite all of the issues that it does have. It is actually superior. Like if the software, like games and stuff, were made specifically for Linux, like they are for Windows, people really probably most likely would not use Windows. But since it's not, people still do, and that's how the market is, because of that whole psychological thing that I explained earlier. But, sorry, that hurts. But you already do use Linux in many ways, and so you already have experience with it. Even if you use Apple, Apple is actually written from BSD. So Mac OS is written from BSD, which isn't a Linux, but it's derived from the identical same sources as Linux is, and the core. So a lot of the software that is compatible with Apple actually was developed for Linux, and it just works with Apple with very minor alterations. So you still benefit from Linux if you use Apple. So that said, hopefully I see you in the forums. Hopefully I explained quite a bit to you. One of the daunting tasks you're going to have if you start to use Linux is deciding what Linux is right for you. Remembering that, unlike Windows, you're kind of going to learn to do these things. And a lot of people say that Linux has a learning curve, which I told you I would talk about later, so here I am. The reality is, actually Windows has the learning curve. You grew up on it. So you grew up learning that learning curve. In reality, the Linux learning curve is nowhere near that of Windows. It's actually easier. And so in a world, an industrialized world like America, where you're raised on Windows, there's no real way to test that. However, going to tribes in Africa, which they did some years ago, one tribe maintains a Windows server, one tribe does a Linux server. They are able to actually see the vast difference. And after about 6 months, it took them 6 months to still need help, but operate that Windows server on their own. The Linux server was able to do it in 2 weeks and maintain it themselves. So the learning curve in Linux is actually smaller. You're just not raised with Linux. And Linuxes have come a long way since I've started. So many of the issues that they used to have, like compiling graphics drivers and other things, you don't have to worry about anymore. A lot of those paper cuts have been solved. So anyway, hopefully I will see you in the forums, and have a good day.